In the east of Singapore, there is a stockpile the government keeps under guard. Not oil, not weapons, not food. Sand. Plain construction sand, stockpiled the way other nations stockpile crude oil. Why would a country guard sand? Because 1 in every 5 meters of this country did not exist 60 years ago. If you've ever landed at Changi, your plane touched down on ground that used to be open sea. The financial district stands where ships once anchored. Few countries have redrawn their own outline as boldly as Singapore. But land you build yourself has one property the guidebooks never mention. It keeps moving. This is the story of a country that built 1/5 of its own territory, and then discovered that building land is not the same as finishing it. Since 1965, Singapore has grown from 580 square kilometers to more than 730. 1/5 of the country lifted straight out of the sea, Changi Airport, Marina Bay, the entire East Coast, the industrial island of Jurong. Reclaiming a single square kilometer takes roughly 1 million truckloads of sand. Not a convoy, a conveyor belt running for decades. For most countries, the map is a given, something only wars and centuries can redraw. Here, the map is a working document. It gets edited, extended, and republished, one district at a time. But you cannot conjure land out of nothing. This way of growing runs on a raw material, sand. According to the UN, Singapore became by far the world's largest importer of sand, bringing in more than 500 million tons over 20 years. And from here, the story winds up like a spring. First, Singapore bought its land from the neighbors, barge by barge. Then, the neighbors stopped selling. So the country learned to make land almost without sand. And now, it is building new ground for a different reason entirely. The old ground may not be high enough. But to understand Singapore's newest project, you first need to know how ordinary sand became a strategic resource. 1819. Raffles founds a port on a swampy island. 3 years later, some 300 workers spend 4 months cutting down a hill and dumping it into the marsh below. Boat Quay stands on that ground today. The habit of making land is older than the country itself. 1965. Singapore is expelled from its union with Malaysia. No oil, no timber, not even enough fresh water, and barely any space. For most nations, running out of land is a metaphor. Here, it was a diagnosis. And the newborn country made the decision that defined everything. If there is no land, make it. For half a century, barges carried sand. Sand poured into the sea, and out of the sea came a country. The sand was bought from the neighbors, Indonesia, Malaysia, later Cambodia. And then the neighbors looked at their own coastlines. Sea sand was dredged off Indonesia on such a scale that the UN and Indonesia's own officials linked it to the disappearance of roughly 24 small islands. Pieces of one country were being shipped away to become part of another. One island, Nipa, had nearly slipped underwater by 2003, and Indonesia had to fill it back in, because its maritime border runs through it. First, Malaysia closed the door, then Indonesia, and that year, for the first time, Singapore cracked open its strategic reserve, the way countries tap oil reserves during an embargo. Then Cambodia. And in 2018, Malaysia did it again, this time quietly. So quietly that the rest of the world did not find out until the following year, from a Reuters investigation. Sand had become what oil was in the 20th century, a strategic resource, with embargoes, a black market, and smugglers. Barges with sand of unknown origin are still caught in these straits, the latest in the autumn of 2024. And that is when engineers asked the question that changed the country. Can you make land almost without sand? The answer came from the country that has been making land longer than anyone on Earth. The first country in this series survived by turning sea into ground. Singapore was watching closely. Picture a patch of sea bigger than 1,000 football fields. The usual way is to fill it. barge after barge, until land rises from the seabed. Singapore did the opposite. It built a wall around the water, sealed the sea off, switched on the pumps, and waited for the sea to disappear. This is not reclamation, it is drainage. So Singapore called the people who had been doing this for centuries the Dutch. They call it a polder, and they have lived this way for 400 years. Now the trick works in the tropics. The place is Pulau Tekong, a military island far from the tourist trail. Behind a 10-kilometer dike, 800 hectares of future land, sitting 1.2 meters below the sea on the other side of the wall. If you stood on that dike, the sea would be higher on one side than the new country on the other. And it needs roughly half the sand of classic reclamation, because you are no longer filling the sea, you are fencing it out. The polder was finished in September 2025, less than a year ago. The pumps come on. Behind the dike, the water creeps down, centimeter by centimeter. And from under the retreating water, ground appears that did not exist the day before. Dark, glistening, dotted with puddles, like the bottom of a drained aquarium. New land, made not by filling the sea in, but by taking the sea away. Singapore had learned to make land with far less of its neighbor's sand. What the brochures never mention is what happens to manufactured land afterwards. New land has a price, and the sea pays the first installment. Coastlines shift, seabed becomes foundation, mangroves give way. Singapore is trying to bring some of those mangroves back, but replacing a coastline is easier than replacing an ecosystem. The strangest cost, though, is not at the edges of the new land, it is underneath it. Fresh reclaimed ground behaves like a fresh pillow. Under the weight of buildings, roads, and its own grains, it keeps compacting and settling for years. Engineers know this, so new land is left to rest, sometimes for a very long time. Marina Bay was reclaimed in the 1970s, and then, for 30 years, nothing glamorous happened. No skyline, no towers. The land just sat there, settling. Today, some of the most expensive real estate in Asia stands on it. Land here is not something you have, it is something you maintain. And almost all of this new land is low. Nearly a third of the country sits less than 5 meters above sea level. As long as the sea stayed calm, that was just a line in a textbook. And compacting sand is only one of the ways ground can move here. In July 2026, scientists at Nanyang Technological University showed something stranger. The Great Earthquake of 2004, the one off Sumatra, did not end in 2004. The shaking stopped. The tsunami was gone. But deep underground, the planet kept moving. A weak layer beneath the region is still flowing, incredibly slowly, more like warm honey than solid rock. And as it flows, land hundreds of kilometers away keeps sinking. In Thailand, in Malaysia, and in Singapore. Decades after the earthquake itself was over. The effect is small, millimeters a year, but official sea level projections do not yet account for it. Grains of sand are compacting under a brand new district, while the planet itself is still answering a catastrophe from 20 years ago. Singapore is dealing with movement on two completely different levels at once. And both of them are saying the same thing. This country's map is never final. The ground moves, the sea is rising, and the coastline Singapore spent decades editing like a draft now has to be designed on a different horizon. Not for decades, but for generations. And this spring, machines finally went into the water. Not for another airport, not for another port. This time, Singapore had started building the most unusual project in its history, its next coastline. It is called Long Island. 3 stretches of new land, around 800 hectares, running 15 kilometers along the east coast, their outer edge raised higher than today's shore, in one continuous line. Between the islands and the old coast, a new reservoir will hide, the country's 18th. Singapore is short of water too. But notice what changed. For 200 years, Singapore made land because it was running out of room behind the shoreline. Long Island flips that logic. This time, The new land is the shoreline. Singapore is building a new coast in front of the old one. Land whose job is not to hold a city, but to stand between the city and the open sea. Land as housing, land as an airport, land as a port. And now, land as pure infrastructure, like a dike, like a reservoir, like a pumping station. Except this time, the infrastructure looks like an island. Singapore has never treated its coastline as a border. It treats it as a draft. For this country, land is infrastructure. You can build it, drain it, reinforce it, raise it, redesign it, but you never really finish it. The Netherlands dug itself below the sea. Jakarta is collapsing under its own weight. Mexico City drank the lake it was standing on. Singapore chose a fourth way. Don't argue with the map, republish it. And that is why, somewhere in the east of the country, a stockpile of sand still sits under guard. Not because Singapore knows what its coastline will look like in 100 years, but because it knows one thing for certain: it will not look the way it does today. Somehow, it works.